Good afternoon, Tim. How you doing?
Good afternoon, Shabbar. I'm very good. Yeah, my cold has mainly cleared up, and I spent the weekend running an in-person money workshop. So I was working with a group of people, and we spent 2 days diving deep into money and them and money, not money out there and investments and prices and interest rates, but them and money and emotion. And it was wonderful. Very good. So I'm good.
The workshop is a fantastic way to dive into this work. That's where we first met. So I think I'd like to come on another workshop. It'd be interesting to do another workshop actually after all of the time that we've spent together and just uncovering new depths to this work. So for all of you, next time there's a money workshop and we talk about it, make sure you sign up. And in person versus online, how did you experience having people in the flesh as opposed to
They're
virtually?
both really good. But yeah, I do them online so people all around the world can come. And there's nothing like being in the room with people. But both work very well. And they're quite different, actually. But I think that would take us down a whole other conversation. And I know today you want to continue our series on spending.
Yeah, our spending series continues. So just to recap, we've had our first conversation, which was more focused on the people that might be overspending, and that as almost like a chronic condition of overspending. The opposite, which are people that could afford to spend but just don't, and underspending. We covered that in our first part. In the second part, we then focused more on people's money value. So how do they align their spending with what's important?
Or
And so
simply put, how do we prioritize what we're going to spend our money on?
exactly. And there was a great exercise that
Excuse me.
we did, very simple exercise that you can do on your own with a partner, etc., to really dial in on the things that are important to you when it comes to spending money. And today we're going to focus on how people make purchases or how people spend money in different ways. And we've got a story on that, and also some patterns that you've seen through your work with people around this, more along the lines of, some people are very comfortable spending on others and can do that quite easily. And there's no tension or friction in that. And some people find it very difficult to spend on themselves or vice versa. So we're going to sort of touch upon styles and patterns, I think, today
In spending.
in spending.
Yeah. And in terms of, what I'd hope someone would get out of this today, it would depend on who you are and what your style is. But I think there's an unusual amount for many people of a certain background angst when we spend money. So last week we talked about, as you said, what are your priorities? What are the areas of life that you will spend money on? And that can remove some of the angst because you think, yeah, I'll put my money, my discretionary income, whatever, in this direction because I've decided it's important. And I'll feel okay of not spending money in these areas because they're not my priorities. And so the outcome of that exercise often is a relaxation, both about where you spend and where you don't. And still, different types of people experience different tension around spending. So what we hope people get out of today is to be more and more free to spend whatever money you have in service of the things that are really important to you and your life, and in a joyful way. Could we spend money joyfully and happily and without angst, guilt, or spending too long analysing it?
Sounds ideal. Okay, let's crack on. So the story that I mentioned to you, I think it was several months ago, was around my daughter who was buying her first car. And she came to me and said, Dad, I think I want to buy a car now. And so I actually was thinking, this is just an area that I'm not equipped to deal with.
Cars, you mean?
Cars,
Cars
I just,
particularly.
golf clubs right up my street. Cars, not so much. And I said, okay, well, she was very clear, first and foremost, Dad, this is my budget for the car. This is my budget for the total sort of year's running cost.
Great.
And so immediately I was feeling rather proud as a bit of a self-confessed budget nerd that, my daughter's thinking very clearly around, how much does she want to spend? I thought that was fantastic. So we then started looking at cars that were in and around her budget. We started shortlisting a few, then we started to go out and see a few. And it became apparent that I was looking at what's the best spec you could get within the budget. So once we saw cars that I felt, from my limited knowledge and speaking to a few people, what are sort of good quality cars in terms of the manufacturer. Okay. So, these generally are considered reliable, economical to run, this, that, the other, etc. So maybe we look at these 3 or 4 manufacturers, and then it's about, the mileage, the service history, and all of that sort of stuff. So we're getting into the data, and the specification.
Data-driven decision.
Data-driven specification, Bluetooth, climate control, this, that, the other, heated seats. And it became apparent whilst we were driving around northwest London, going to all of these used car places, that my daughter was not as, let's say, enthusiastic about the specs. They were important, but for her, she was like, I feel like, I need a connection to the car. And I'm just like, what the? And she was like, yeah, she was like, for me, I don't mind if the specifications aren't as good, but if I feel a connection and I feel like this car is the right car for me, then that will be amazing, because, and I can tell that this is my car. And I'm like, yeah, but it doesn't have Bluetooth. And so it really just opened up my eyes to how people make spending decisions,
how differently people do it.
Yeah, I'm all about the functionality, the spec, what is the best specification car you can get for your budget. And she looked at it differently. So you said that this is a great one to unpack.
I think it's really useful. And what I loved when you first shared the story with me is it really was a surprise and a revelation to you how different your daughter was. But what I also loved is you didn't judge. It made you curious. So before we dive into spending, maybe for people who are newer to the podcast, or even as a reminder to people who have been listening, the number one thing we can do to really shift our money patterns and become more conscious about money is just to be curious. When we meet someone else who has a different money pattern, or a situation that's maybe triggering some emotion or some judgment, the number one step is to go from our fixed view where we go, oh, she's crazy, or she's going to buy a terrible car, or how could they do this? Or to go, oh, I'm having a reaction, I'm judging, or I'm feeling emotional or astonished. What might that be telling me about my limited or fixed money beliefs, money stories, right? So before we get into spending, that's a key thing for anyone. Just stay curious. And as soon as you notice yourself get maybe a bit triggered and caught in an emotion or a judgment about money, just go, I can learn something here. So I love that you were open to that.
And just off the back of that, we sort of extended the sort of conversation to other items where she feels a connection to.
Nice.
And then stuffed toys, like stuffed animals, came up.
Yeah.
And how she finds it hard to pass them on, because I'm not saying that she thinks that they're real, because obviously she knows that they're not real, but there's almost like a human-like quality to stuffed animals, because they have names. And even when my 5-year-old might pick up a stuffed toy and just throw it, across the room, there is a sort of reaction to that, because she's just so emotionally connected to things. So that was just really interesting for me.
Well, let's talk about that. And I notice in the language, stuffed toys is an extreme example. But you talk about, I'm data-driven, Tim. I will choose a car based on the spec, and I'm assuming, and it's not just a car, it might be many, many things. Maybe not everything. Maybe you don't choose an orange on spec, but fundamentally, your logic goes something like this. I will break down this thing I'm going to buy, whether it's a holiday or a day out or a car or whatever it is. We talked about you buying clothes in an earlier episode, and socks, and I will break down, well, it may not be conscious, but effectively I'll figure out a certain number of criteria: the importance, price, quality, etc. And I'll try and optimize the qualities that I believe important: mileage, reputation, reliability, price, features, etc. And whichever comes out on top, I will try and choose that car. And that's fine. And I'm sure a lot of people listening do that, or do that to some extent. What I want to say before I dive into different approaches, if we stay curious, we're not here to make one or other better or worse or good or bad. What we're always trying to do with our money work is expand our range of options and start to become honest about what's the downside of the way I do things. And what we also know in money work is how I am about any one area of money, like choosing a beer in a pub, looks trivial, but actually is probably rippling out into all of our decisions and actually all our life. So there's quite a lot in how I choose to buy something. So you've described a fairly typical data-driven, what we might call psychologically a more left-brained, cognitive, thinking-based approach. And we might come on to some of Jung's work on different personal styles or preferences later. But fundamentally yours is what Jung would call a thinking-based approach. And it believes, I'm simplifying a load of psychology here, but I'll go quick. It assumes the best way I make a decision, in this case a spending one, is by figuring out the salient data, weighing it up, kind of being dispassionate, almost taking myself or any emotion or feeling or any of that. I like pink, I like blue. I take myself out of it and I just try and look at the numbers because I have a faith that the numbers somehow will lead me to the correct or best decision. Does that sort of make sense for your style? A thinking-based, if we call it that, approach to spending in many ways is reinforced in our society. So if we're not careful, we think it's the right way or the best way because, as you and I have discussed many, many times on the podcast, we live in a society that puts tremendous faith and weight on numbers, that believes money is a rational, technical, logical thing. So it would be particularly easy to think, well, of course you have to make a spending decision based on the numbers because money is rational. Okay. Briefly, because I want to talk about the other side, which is maybe more unusual and interesting, and then people can reflect on how they could use both approaches. But briefly in your life, how does that work for you? Like, what's the upside and the downside of being very thinking-based, logical decision maker with spending? What's good about it for you? And what sucks about it for you? And I think we've discussed a bit on the podcast.
So the positives for me are I'm going to be making more of an informed decision based on like stats, specification. So there's a feeling that I'm going to get less ripped off. I'm going to be making more of a confident purchase. So around that sort of theme. And the negative is really around the tension and anxiety that you're investing a lot of time in stats and specifications, etc. So it can be a bottomless pit of research.
And we've talked about that on the podcast, haven't we?
We've talked about this.
Hours finding the best,
Yeah, because there's always going to be something with slightly better specs. Like it's just very difficult to make a conclusive, definitive decision around that. And so it does become there's less spontaneity. It's a bit soulless when you're then just doing it on sort of specs and criteria and numbers. It sucks the joy out of spending sometimes rather than just choosing one and feeling at ease that, you know what, I really like this. It may or may not work out, but I feel happy with, this particular product, whatever it is.
And it sounds like almost if you're too much just with the rational analysis, you might deny that part of you that just has a hunch that I really love this one, or this one's really exciting to me. But then you normally might go, oh no, but I can't because the number's not the best on that one. Does that make sense? You almost deny some other part of you that does feel connected to it, maybe.
I did operate in that way. It's only since we've been recording the podcast and these things have been reflected back to me the way I've been making spending decisions that now I do feel a bit more at ease of just going with it. That it's a very hard pattern to break. Just an example, buying hiking socks for my trip to Nepal, like very data driven, like reviews, thread count, merino wool content, and price, and factoring all of those things.
Yeah. All right.
So minefield.
What I want to say is I'm not suggesting it's a habit you need to get out of. Again, to come back to what I was saying before I sort of put you on the spot with a question, we're not saying one's better or worse. What we're saying with all money is we tend to have fixed ways of doing things. And if we're fixed and rigid because we kind of think that's the only way to do it or the right way or there's no other way of doing it, we're likely to have a more narrow range of possibilities. And by definition, we'll probably deny ourselves things that might be valuable. So in your case, data-driven, you're probably less likely to get ripped off or buy a lemon. You have some confidence, some sense of control. But as you say, it can feel heavy, tight, almost endlessly analytical. And maybe you shut down bits of you that go, oh, well, I know it's only number 4 on my list, but I really love those things. All right. So, as I say, in a Jungian psychology, we'd say that's a very strongly thinking-based approach. And what I want to say to people listening is, as I said, in our culture, it often reinforces a thinking-based approach. We often think that's correct or right, and that's very much reinforced around money. A good question is, does that approach in my life lead to more happiness or lead to what I really want? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Let's take your daughter, because she said some beautiful things. And actually, when you said that, I want to share a couple of examples from my life that are probably going to freak you out completely. I'm more like your daughter, just my typology. Your daughter said something beautiful. She said, I will know the right car for me. I want to feel a connection to the car. Almost made me think about things people might say when they're dating or looking for a partner. I want to find a connection to that person. You know, maybe on paper, they don't stack up or they don't tick all my boxes, but they're the right one for me. And I love them. Maybe I even had a list, but somehow I drop the list when I see the right car. And that might be really challenging for someone like you. And that might evoke in you feelings like, but you might get ripped off, or you might not have the best deal, or you might not have maximized something. But it's very real. Now, quick step into psychology. Jung calls that more an F, a feeling-based preference. And as you and I have discussed, you're a T, you're a thinking style person. I'm a strong F style person. A feeling type person does the opposite, right? So a thinking type person, when they make any decision, but, you know, particularly here a money decision, it's almost like, I'll take me out of the equation. So I might have a feeling I love this or this looks great. No, that will lead me to a bad decision. So a thinking type person steps out of it and goes data, 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 and they sort of believe in accuracy and objective truth. They probably believe, a thinking-based person, there is the best option out there. There is the correct option given the data. So one of the reasons it's very tight for you and tiring is you're endlessly in search, I'm guessing, of the right answer. Does it make sense?
Yeah, that was go check out the Amex voucher episode
Right.
to hear a more in-depth
Right.
kind of conversation around the perils of trying to maximize.
And the feeling-based person does the opposite. They say, well, there is no objectively right answer. This car might turn out good. This car might turn out good. This hotel, I don't know. And they don't have the same confidence that data will deliver the right answer. But they're like, what is right for me? And that's more a subjective feeling-based approach. So an F-type person puts themselves into the situation and they would sort of say, well, what's it like to me? How do I feel about it? How do I respond? And so it would make sense for someone looking for a car to go, well, you know, I don't know much about cars. I don't want to do anything stupid. I'm going to listen to my dad about data, but I think I'm going to walk in that lot and just one of them, I will have a feeling for.
Yeah,
it's going to speak to me. And to someone like you, that might sound crazy, but to them, it's very real. So I want to share one example in my life, and then I want to talk about generally what might this mean for people's spending decisions who are listening to this, and the kind of pros and cons of both. And what we really want is people to have a wide range of possibility. When I bought my first house, big spending decision, but I also have an example of buying something when I was 13 for about £100, which is exactly the same thing. Small spending, well, big then.
Well, that was big for 13, so.
Well, let me do that one quickly. When I was, I think about 13, I was left £100 in the will of a great aunt. It was a lot of money, but it still wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was, you know, and I had no idea what to do with it. I didn't have a plan. I wasn't looking for anything. I lived in London. I was in town with a good friend. I walked into a shopping centre and I saw what then was very unusual. Now they're widespread, which was a sort of import of ethnic bits and pieces. Now they're everywhere, but that was over 40 years ago.
What was it? An imported?
It had lots of sort of things from Bali and Thailand and carvings and statues and wall hangings. And now it's much more common and we have the internet. But I walked in and it was like going to this amazing grotto of just the most incredible things. And I saw this wooden carved dragon, about, I don't know, 2 or 3 foot, green. And you can probably tell by the way I'm talking about it.
You're really into it.
Yeah, yeah. And I feel touched talking about it. And I just knew I wanted to have it. And I spent my £100 on this thing. And I went back home and my two brothers took the piss out of me for years. They were incredulous. It made no sense to them. And the moral of the story is I still have the dragon, 40, however many years later. It's been with me in every house, and it has become from the moment an utterly cherished item that now everyone loves, and they love the story. So that's nothing about numbers. But in that moment, and this is how I am wired, it's like a connection. I just knew. And at that moment, the number, can I get a cheaper one? Is there something else? Should I spend? None of that mattered. And I'm glad I was able to follow it. The downside of being overly data driven is we shut down, or we don't listen to what I call those deeper life impulses. Similar with a house, I'll make a long story short, buying my first house. How do you buy a house? What do you look for? It's a big deal, right? So I tried different things, and I did actually create a list, because I thought, well, this is proper money. I can't be like my dragon. So I created a list, and I put big garden and boom, 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 this long list. And I looked for 6 months, and I even put an offer on 2 houses. They both fell through, for which I'm delighted. And after 6 months, hadn't found anything based on my list. I went away on a meditation retreat, because that's something I've always done in my life, several times a year. I came home very inspired, very connected, again, with that sort of unmeasurable, unquantifiable aspect of life that's very important to me. People might call it heart, soul, spirit, meaning, whatever you call it, but you can't measure it and you can't fit it in a spreadsheet. I was very inspired. I came home, I remember, and I ripped up my list, and I said, the only thing is I want to find a house that's a good place to practice meditation. And within a few days, I don't remember exactly how long, I had a phone call from the agent, and he said, this thing's come up. It's absolutely not what you're looking for, but we thought you might like to have a look. And I went, and it absolutely wasn't what I was looking for. And that night, I had a very strong dream, and I woke up and I thought, this is the house. And I put an offer in, and I got it, and it was an incredibly wonderful house. Now, I just share that story of a small thing, like a wooden dragon in Leicester Square, and a big life purchase of a completely different way of making a decision. It's not better, but it is very different. So let me pause, and maybe we can reflect. I'm interested in your response, and then we maybe can draw it together for people about how they might access both of these ways in their own decision.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking of that story, and it's quite romantic.
I am a quite romantic soul.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it's funny, because this being open to both sides is quite a nice place to be able to hang out, because old Shabba would have just poo-pooed that kind of story a little bit.
I just want to say one more thing. In a minute, I'll tell you how much money I made on that house, and then you might not poo-poo it. But that wasn't my intention.
Yeah, but it's almost like, you did what based on a dream, this, that, the other. It all sounds like, for a tea,
Yes.
as we were talking.
Yes.
But I realised that that's equally as valid a way of going about purchasing a house. I mean, I would always sort of caveat that I think you could lead with or what I'm trying to do is sort of lead with the F, maybe in certain ways. But it's like what we always say, still being sensible about money and not buying something that's obviously got a leaking roof, and you still go ahead with it despite some really strong alarm bells. But it's almost like you're just buying it from a different place. And I think that's quite nice. And we're just so, I don't think if we're so ingrained by society, but there is a narrative around, being smart, being sensible, all of those things with money. And you do lose that other side, which is actually quite beautiful, enriching, nourishing, all of those things.
I also want to add to that, and I don't know the answer, they are beautiful and nourishing and enriching, but it is entirely possible that when we make decisions from that place, or at least listen to that place, those decisions, even in financial terms, turn out better for us. I don't know if they do. I don't have the research, but the problem of the thinking-based approach would be to assume that if I decide with my heart or choose based on connection, I'm going to make a worse decision in the things that matter to me. The problem with the feeling-based approach is, as you say, to be totally stupid about the numbers. So if I'd had a survey done and they said, look, this is an absolute wreck and you're paying well over the odds, and I'd had no sense of the work required, you at least have to reality check, okay, do I really trust this dream? And maybe you do. So both can lead to poor decisions when they're very extreme, but both make assumptions about the other one. And I think the thinking-based assumption is, well, all right, it's nice to be a bit romantic or feel the connection, or yes to my daughter. Maybe you do feel a connection, that's fine. But secretly, I still think you've made a worse decision. And we'll come on to why this might be. But my suggestion is, if we can access all of our knowing, so yes, our heads and our thinking mind and our spreadsheets, very useful human activity, but not the be all and end all. If I can also access my sense of connection, desire, do I really want these golf clubs or do I really want these ones? There's increasing kind of physiological and scientific evidence that those things are real, that our hearts are like mini brains and our guts are like mini brains. And if we listen to them, we might actually make decisions that work out on all levels.
Yeah. And I've just had conversations with people, and I'm just recounting them, around people that have bought property to live in or as investments based on the rational side, thinking, well, this makes sense, this is a good decision, etc. But in conversations when you're just alone with them, sometimes I've had people that have just said, it wasn't a great experience living there. The family wasn't happy, this, that, and the other. We've had to move, etc. So you can't discount the fact that just going with one side is always gonna give you the results, because as we've said in a lot of these things, the quality of the deal, as in the numerical outcome, doesn't guarantee you the experience that you're after, right? In everything we've said, it doesn't matter whether you're spending a few quid on a pair of socks or buying a house. The experience is by no means guaranteed by how the financials or the money looks.
I think that's the key takeaway for today. And so what I'm thinking, Shabbar, is let's dive into more about why that is. You've already alluded to it. And maybe the question of spending on oneself, we talk about in a separate podcast, because I think this has taken us into some really, really nice territory. Yeah, you're right that on this podcast, one of the stories we've told frequently is Peter Koenig, the founder of this work, his distinction between following a money path and a life path. One could say, or at least connect, money path is when I am preoccupied with money, numbers, entities, a whole kind of, it is a numbers, money-based view. And the assumption when I follow my money path is by sorting out the numbers in the optimum best way, whatever that means to you, salary, pension, saving, etc. But the assumption is, if I sort out the number, the quantities, the things I can measure, that will lead to what I want, which is this sort of intangible quality of life, a feeling of well-being, etc. And as we said, our society reflects that back at us and tells us, but often it's not the way. As you say, I might make the decision that looks like the best investment, but I don't feel happy there, or I feel soulless, or I do a job that brings in the best salary and benefits, but this other thing I can't measure about soul or fulfillment or meaning, it's not there. It might be, I could make the best decision and it's a perfect house and then I get both. But if I only focus on the numbered centered criteria of the car or the job or the house or the pension, and I don't listen to these other parts of my intelligence, whether we call it heart intelligence or gut intelligence or what Jung would call the feeling quality, if I don't listen to them, no surprise, I might in a few years go, well, my numbers are looking good, but my life lacks soul or joy, etc. And in Peter's work, what he's encouraging us to do is much more put at the center the things that really bring us alive. Now, the question is, if I'm about to buy something, I don't know. I'm going to buy a car. I don't know what's going to give me vitality or joy, or I'm going to buy a house. I don't know what's going to support, by definition, of these intangible things I want, right? I want to feel good in my house. I want it to feel healthy or inspiring or warm or cozy. I don't actually know. So the question is this: in order to, let's say, maximize all the intangible, can I get that through a set of numbers, or do I have to listen in the spending decision to these strange, romantic, whatever you call them, things about, well, I just feel a connection? I don't know why, but I just love the yellow car, Dad. I don't know why, but these golf clubs just feel like they belong with me. All of these are intangible, non-quantifiable. They're what we call qualities rather than quantities. But can they lead us to make wiser decisions? Well, I think they can. What do you think?
So the way that I look at this is through this sort of a lens whereby, okay, let's say for me buying a house, if I did, let's say, buy a house purely on do the numbers stack up, etc., and is it a good investment for the long term, blah blah blah, and if I totally ignored the romantic element or the feeling element, I think, and even there, just like I think, that's my thinking side, it's sort of kicking in. Well, I don't believe that it would lead to a very harmonious life because it hasn't come from a very life-centered approach. So automatically, the way that you're being in the house with your family, etc., might be compromised if you made a decision that was, solely based on numbers, etc. And I can see that playing out in sort of quite a few ways. But even, let's say, with smaller purchases, I can also see the fact that if something goes wrong or the expectations aren't met from the product or the purchase, because you've just ignored the fact that, do I really like this? The feeling that, the romantic element, I think you can be left more disappointed. So I look at it from that point of view that, and so having a balanced approach and looking at it like my daughter does, I don't think she's ever going to be disappointed or feel let down, etc. But the numbers, because they don't guarantee you the quality of the experience that you're looking for, can often lead you to a place of dissatisfaction. And that's because maybe it's a very money-centered approach. So I think that the life-centered approach does offer you that maybe greater possibility of having an experience that will leave you less kind of disappointed.
I want to make a couple of distinctions. So we're talking about these two ways as a thinking and feeling based approach. In terms of life-centered, I don't want to just say it's feelings-based because then we're making the thinking-based worse. We could also use thinking in terms of life-centered. It might just depend on choosing different criteria, but that's probably a whole other conversation. But yeah, maybe thinking might lead to disappointment, A, because you're aiming at the right answer, where you're not so much with the gut feel, you're just trusting it. And B, because if I'm only with the thinking, I miss out this intelligence of all of these unquantifiable things. And then later I go, actually, they're quite important.
And the other things, and I just look at experiences and sometimes with my parents, you do the thing that feels right. And like you say, it just turns out amazingly well. And you could have never imagined that whatever you were doing didn't make sense financially to do that, or the numbers didn't, but somehow the universe conspires and it ends up being, and there's no rhyme or reason as to why, but you came from it from I'll say a more wholesome place.
Maybe a more trusting place, a more whole place.
And there's no reason, there's no rationality behind that, but it happens and we see it all the time. So it can't be discounted.
Well, one way I would think about it is this. In a life-centered approach to money or dealing with money or spending, in a life-centered, we take more the image of a forest than a factory. So a money-centered one's like a factory. I do this, then this happens, and I optimize this, and I regulate this. All the language of a factory is about optimizing, measuring, monitoring, counting, and predicting what's going to come out the factory line. In a forest, it's not quite like that. Something comes out, which is a healthy, growing, dynamic forest, but the way it comes is a bit unpredictable. You can't really control it. But what you know is the thing comes from lots and lots and lots of interconnections. The beetles connected with the leaves, and the leaves connected with the forest floor, and that's connected with the tree. And so a life-centered approach emphasizes the sort of power of multiple relationships, multiple connections, whereas a factory, a money-based thing, emphasizes the power of control and predictability with numbers. So what I'm wondering from this conversation is if I can listen to as much as possible to make my decision. So yes, the numbers, but also this tingling in my gut and my dream and my heart, not because it's better, but because I'm opening the decision to more parts of the situation, more parts of my intelligence, then there's more interconnections. And somehow the decision that I look back 5 years later and go, I'm really glad I did that. It's because I'm using a wider intelligence rather than a narrow one. It's not saying just using my gut or my dream is better than just thinking. But if I can use it all, I'm increasing relationships. And I think that's, for me, the definition of a life-centered approach. I wanted to say one or two more things, and then maybe we close or think about what people can really take away. I really love what you said. In a left brain approach, how I make the decision or how I feel when I make the decision isn't going to influence what happens, right? So if I'm tight and stressed and I spent 3 days thinking about my holiday to maximize the number and I'm all a bit grumpy and maybe a bit anxious, but I still make the decision in a thinking-based approach as well, that doesn't matter. I've made the decision. That's what influences the decision. But maybe it's not as simple as that. Maybe if I make a decision from a place of love, trust, relaxation and openness, then part of whether that's to buy a thing on the menu or buy a house or buy a pair of socks, that unmeasurable, unquantifiable atmosphere that begins the whole thing, in other words, how I am when I make the decision, maybe that does have some influence on how it turns out in a very mysterious, intangible way. So maybe it's important, whatever decision we make and however we balance them, to make the decision as far as we can from a place of trust in ourselves and listening to everything and, dare I say it, sense of love, connection to whatever's going on. I've got no evidence about that, but that would strike me as possible.
There's lots of stuff that we just can't quantify, but there's definitely an energy and a force that is prevalent in our lives. So yeah, we could get down a spiritual, religious kind of route, but I think we've probably given that quite a good deep dive for today. Do you want to recap and any particular takeaways? I had one question actually for you before we wrap up, because you asked me sort of like what are the positives and negatives like in the way that sort of I approach like making decisions. It would be really useful for the opposite side to know, well, you know, what are the positive and negative sides of the
F base?
Yeah, of the F base.
Well, simply put, I think we did touch on them, but maybe I didn't directly. The F base, the positive, we could say, is I'm just using more of my holistic wisdom to make the decision. So I'm listening to head, heart, gut, intuition. And I would say psychologically, what that does is it opens me up to genuine, valuable sources of information that I miss if I just look at numbers. The downside, if I'm one-sided, one is most of us won't always be certain what's just wishful thinking and fantasy versus a genuine gut feel, because in our society, we're not well trained. So that's where you always need a bit of thinking, and you need to develop, we all need to develop as a society these capacities to listen to gut and heart. But the downside potentially is it really a gut feel, or is it just sort of wishful thinking or naivety? And again, even if I have got some gut feel, I do need to at least check in with the numbers and the consequences. That might not mean I don't make the decision, but it does mean at least I know I've kind of done what we might call a reality check. So yeah, I think the downside could be naivety, fantasy, and wishful thinking.
Any particular sort of from the sort of the takeaways for people, anything that they can do, practice or implement?
Yeah, a quick one. I was thinking of this phrase, you often hear it in organizations, what you can't measure doesn't matter. That was a big orthodoxy in management. And that's very much a thinking-based approach. So I would say to anyone listening, identify which of these two styles of spending decision you are more familiar with, more comfortable with. Yeah. And then really explore making some decisions next week with the opposite, just to see what it's like. And probably don't do it with buying a house, but maybe think of a spending decision, or maybe could be even more interesting, take a bit of money that you are happy to spend in service of an experiment, 10 quid, 30 quid, 50 quid, whatever, and think, how do I decide what to do with this money? That would be a great experiment. And if you normally are very thinking based, you could just explore feeling, intuition, synchronicity. You could pray for guidance. You could do anything. And if you're normally very gut based, try and do a really good logical analysis of the best way to spend your money and just play with it. We had an episode, I think, about three podcasts back about the importance of play and experimentation. So play with doing it differently and notice what that gives you and also what your resistances are. And that would be a great experiment.
And then let us know.
And let us know, please. Absolutely.
Lovely. Let's end there, Tim. Really enjoyed that.
Me too.
See you next time.
See you next time. Bye bye.